Go ahead.
Got it. Good. Okay. Well, as we said right at the beginning, it really is just such a delight to be part of the family of God and to experience it in a time like this. I take part in quite a few Zoom meetings over the course of the weeks and months. But I don't know another one like this where every attendee gets a personal welcome as they appear on the screen, and I think it's delightful. It makes the word host live up to its title. I think I've told you this before, that when William Tyndale was translating the letters of Paul, and he was looking at that passage where it speaks about the characteristics of people, potential elders, and one of the things is it says kind to strangers or something like that. I've forgotten what the AV actually says, but he translated it as harborous. And I think that's a wonderful picture. If you think of a harbor kind of stretching out its arm to give comfort and solace and protection to those who come. And I think for people in elders and people in responsibility, sometimes there's a temptation for us to feel a little bit as though there's a kind of a siege mentality kind of going on, and we want to scrutinize everyone who comes in through the doors or even through the screen. But the instinct of those who are elders is that they gather in. They are gatherers. They reach out their arms and gather in. So thank you, Peter, for making all that possible, and everybody else too. Okay, well, I want to talk in one sense today about something which is, it could be sort of quite complex, but I want to take a story from the Old Testament and to make it as simple as I can. A couple of weeks ago in our little church in Bracknell, I shared along these lines, and I just had a feeling when I'd shared that I wasn't done with it, that there were other places that I needed to kind of share something along these lines. One of the things that I've got myself involved in over the last few years is some other churches around the Bracknell area. And I'm part of a thing called a SACRE, which for people outside this country and even people in this country will have no idea what it means. But it's part of the institution of the local council, from the local councils. And they are required to have this meeting to give advice to people who are teaching RE in the schools in our locality. That is very complex because there are people on this SACRE from all kinds of background, not just Christian background. We've got Muslims on there, Hindus, Baha'i, all kinds of things. And it's made me kind of thinking just about what our role ought to be and what our attitudes are to the world as we see us, as we see around us. Things are changing, aren't they? The speed of change is accelerating, and it's difficult to keep up with it. The little phrase that comes to mind often is, "It wasn't like this when I was a boy." No, it wasn't like this when I was a boy. When I was in my early 20s, Dylan, the pop singer, he wrote a song, and its title was "The Times They Are A-Changing," and it became sort of used as almost as the motto, or the motto, or the song for people who wanted to be counterculture. That's to say, people who wanted to push really their own cultures and not just subscribe to or be part of the status quo as it was. And that's what he had to say. At the times they are changing. It's I don't know whether he felt that was true. I don't know whether he feels it's true now. There's an old song, there's an old story about way back of a king, a very wealthy king, who wanted people who visited him to think that he was profound in his wisdom. So he gathered his wise men together and he gave them a project, which was to work on it and come back to him with a phrase that would always be appropriate and would give people this impression of his wisdom and his Yeah, that's the kind of thing. So they went away and they came back with a simple phrase, which was simply, and this too shall pass away. It's a profound statement. This too shall pass away. All these things shall pass away, except there are things, of course, that we know will not pass away. There are things that abide, faith, hope, and love. These abide, and the greatest of these is love. And one of the things it says about love in 1 Corinthians 13 is that it never fails. And that doesn't mean in that particular context, that doesn't mean that it always succeeds, it always triumphs. It just means that it never gives up. It's like a bubbling stream that just continues to bubble, and no matter what happens to it, it keeps on bubbling, it keeps on kind of coming through. I grew up in the Potteries, which is an area of England, just on the edge of kind of the north of England. And we had a house, and behind our house there was an old piece of ground that had a pond in it, which actually just became a dumping ground. It was full of old prams and wheels and all sorts of things. And then they decided that they would really renovate this area, and they would put grass down and trees and everything. So they didn't want this little stream that was coming out from what they call a shordruck. Now there's an education for you. Shordruck. It's a great pile, hundreds of thousands of tons of debris from the crockery industry, provided a kind of a foundation for all sorts of things. And it was just 100 yards away from our house. And this little stream used to bubble out from under the shordruck, go down into what they call the Grange Pond, and then it went through onto a pipe and went, who knows where it went, probably onto the Foley Brook or something like that. So they decided that they didn't want this eyesore, so they were just going to, they decided they'd just bury it. They'd bury this stream, they'd bring in more kind of rubble and stuff, and that would sort it out. And the old folks in the area warned them, and they said, no, you won't stop it, it'll keep on coming. And so what they did, they put all this stuff in, and the old folks were right. They couldn't stop it. It just flooded the whole area. So in the end, they had to dig it all out again and put in piping, because this little stream just would not be stopped. Love never fails. It never stops. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how harshly you treat it. It never stops. It never stops. So there are some things that abide. Okay. We're in a period of relentless change. But it's always been like this. It's always been just exactly like this. There have always been times and seasons which change, but somehow other parts of them don't change. And the hearts of men and women don't change. And we discover the same kind of errors, the same kind of difficulties that they have in their lives today, as we see recorded in the Old Testament way, way back. These are times and seasons. Those are two different words, and they're interesting. At times, almost kind of the events, where the seasons are kind of blocks of events. And the times and the seasons, Jesus said to his disciples when he was about to ascend into heaven, he said, these are things that the Father has put in his own hand. You remember that the disciples had said, is this time you're going to do this and this? And he said, it's not for you to know the times and seasons that the Father has put in his own hands. So we live always in the middle of unfinished stories, and we need always to kind of lift up our hearts to God wherever we are. He knows the times and the seasons. And there's this wonderful promise that comes in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I think it's verse 13, where it says, there's no temptation taken you, but such as is common to men. But God is faithful, who will, with the temptation, make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. So whenever the temptation starts, God has already determined the end of it. It's already, these things are for a fixed period. They won't last forever. Maybe 70 or 80 years, but they won't last forever. And that's our hope. That's our confidence in God. And of course, when time get unsettled like this, you also kind of get a rush to people who want to see the spiritual significance of things and want to see the significance of things in terms of eschatology. That's the teaching of the last things. And that really can be the Wild West of Bible study. Everyone with their own ideas. Charles Spurgeon once said, "Only fools and madmen understand the book of Revelation." I think that may have been a little bit harsh. But what he was saying, on one occasion when he was preaching, he wasn't very impressed by the brethren who had got this all cut and tied and knew exactly when it was going to happen, all the rest of it. In one of his sermons, I think with just a little bit of frustration, he breathed out the phrase, "Ye men of Plymouth, why stand ye gazing up into the heavens?" He was earnest that we should get on with the work that God has given us to do. I was once asked to preach, a very privileged kind of request it was. It came from the Oxford Cambridge Union, Oxford Union, and we don't live very far from Oxford. And to begin with, they wanted me to speak on prayer, and I said, "Okay, I'd be glad to do that." And then about a fortnight before it was due, they got in touch and they said, "And we'd like you to speak on those verses at the end of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Now, let me read you those verses. This is beginning at verse 13. "But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus shall we always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words." So I thought, well, this is going to be an interesting time. And then about a week before, I got a little note, which apparently they send out to all their speakers. And the speakers at the Oxford Cambridge Union have included people like John Stott, he was a very well-known Anglican minister, Billy Graham, all kinds of people, and me. And I guess they've all received this little note, which said something along the lines of, we hope you will appreciate that the Oxford Cambridge Union and Cambridge Unions are made up from people from a wide background and a wide background of convictions. So we do ask that you will undertake not to offend anyone with the particular view you may want to present. So I thought about this and I wrote them back a letter and I said, yes, I was happy to sign it. And I would endeavor not to offend the pre-tribulationists or the mid-tribulationists or the post-tribulationists or the pre-millennialists or the post-millennialists or even the partial rapturists. And that if I succeeded, I might apply for a job at United Nations to see if I can bring about world peace. They took it in good part and we had a good time together. But notice this thing that it says here. Paul says when he writes to the Thessalonians, and he makes it very clear the purpose. And this brings me to my little mantra that I use so often: context, context, context. What is the context of these scriptures? You know, the Bible isn't like a brand tub. It isn't just a place where you can put your finger in and see what you pick out, and yeah, that'll be the verse to today. I know, yes, I know we used to have a promise box as well, but that's not really the way we'd intended to use the Bible. So what is the context of this? Well, Paul is writing to these saints at Thessalonica that they're really fairly new converts. And obviously they have become disturbed. They become disturbed because they were thinking, well, are those who are asleep in Jesus going to miss all the glory of the parousia, that's one of the words that the Bible uses. It really means the presence, the coming of the Lord. And Paul writes to them and he says, I don't want you to be ignorant. So this passage of scripture was written to give them knowledge that they lacked and to give some clarification to some of their particular issues that they were struggling with. And then you get to the end of this, and it says in verse 18 of chapter 4, therefore comfort one another with these words. You'll notice it doesn't say try to frighten one another to death with your speculations about the second coming. It says comfort one another with it. These passages of scripture were given to comfort. And this word comfort is such a rich word. It's there are two words that are quite different in the New Testament, and they don't make a distinction quite often as we read them. One is really consolation, which does mean the, like putting your arm around somebody and saying, okay, it'll be okay, we'll see this through together, something like that. But there's this other one, which is comfort, and this word comfort is parakaleo. Now, if you may be hearing parakaleo, that is actually very like the word paraclete, which is translated as the advocate, someone who's called alongside to help, to strengthen. It's a word with really such a richness of word. And here Paul says he's writing these things to encourage them, to strengthen them, to exhort them. He wants them to know things that they don't know, and he wants them to be encouraged and to go on with these things. Who wrote it? With what purpose? Well, these kind of things, particularly things like the book of the Revelation, my personal conviction that is, it was not given to us to give us a timetable of events for the last days, but as an explanation of the powers that operate in all ages and will come to their consummation in the last days. It was always relevant and is always relevant and will be always relevant, even if the Lord should tarry, from the day it was written until time shall be no more. The book of the Revelation is a prophetic work, and it's called a prophecy, but it's also apocalyptic. Now, that's a particular genre of kind of literature in Bible days, which I'm not going to go into now, but it does affect the way we interpret things. So I'm going to give you my summary of the book of Revelation, just in 6 words. God is still on the throne. And it wasn't written to people who had a lot of time on their hands and could kind of work out all the niceties and all the details of all these prophecies. It was written to little panting flocks of God's people in different parts of Asia Minor, as it was in those days, who were in fear of their lives. The persecutions were increasing and was set to increase even more. It's a book of thrones. It concludes with a single throne, the throne of God and of the Lamb. And it was given, the book of Revelation, not to frighten people, not only to give them some glimpse of what was coming, but it was given to comfort and encourage all saints in all times. And it's interesting that the book of Revelation has often been a great comfort to saints when they have been in times of persecution. The book speaks to their need, as the Quakers would have said. Okay, I want to talk about the times that are changing, and I've got different titles for this particular topic tonight. I thought at one time of calling it just simply, I'm just looking for my notes to see what I was going to call it. Yeah, I can't remember what I was going to call it now. I was going to call it, one of the things I was going to call it was, we may burn, but we won't bow. I was also going to call it something to do with how we respond to what I call global, what's the phrase I'm looking for? There is a mindset which is sweeping the globe, that is set to reset our culture values, and it is increasing with power all the time. It is the totalitarian mindset that is being imposed increasingly in our schools and education, in our society. And how are we Christians, to live at this time? One temptation, I think, would be to go into a siege mentality and say, well, okay, we'll shut the doors and that's what we'll do. We'll just shut the doors and we'll just live here and wait until the Lord comes. And maybe you know that seems to have been one of the reasons why 2 Thessalonians was written. That there were some people who had decided that that interpretation of what Paul had said meant that the coming of the Lord was absolutely on the doorstep, not just imminent, but would happen within a very short time. And they'd quit everything. They'd vanished up into the hills with their cans of beans and were just waiting. And Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians to kind of put that right. Okay. These lines of Dylan or the old wise king or whatever he was, they're a powerful reminder that change is inevitable. The old order is fading away and a new world has been born. And it's up to each of us to decide whether we'll be part of that new world or whether we will cling to the past. Now, I think that, excuse me. I think that for Dylan, he was probably encouraging people to get on board and be part of it. We might interpret it in a different way. Constant change, they say, is here to stay. We are living in a time of the consummation of the ages and have been since the day of Pentecost. Repent, it says in Acts chapter 3. Repent, therefore, and be converted, that your sins may be blotted out, so that times of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord. Seasons of refreshing, times of freshness. And in the latter parts of the letters like Peter's letters and Paul's letters and John's letters, particularly Paul's letters to Timothy and Titus, you have this little phrase, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers. So how are we going to look at this? Let's just move on. I want to tell you something about a man named George Orwell. Some of you may know of this man. He was a writer, he was a socialist, he was a writer, but he was horrified with what he saw, particularly in Stalinist Russia, in their version of communism. And he wrote a book called 1984, which was the first, what they call, it's a dystopian novel. That's to say, it's a post-apocalyptic novel where everything has gone wrong and everything is under control. And it's set in a future society where the government is led by an all-seeing big brother who controls every aspect of the citizens' lives, even their thoughts. And it follows one particular man and his girlfriend. And it's a particular kind of thing. And it's a very interesting, it's a very chilling book to read. It's not particularly edifying, but when I think about it, I think of the era that we're in now, because increasingly with our powers of communication and the rest of it, we're living in a very dangerous age. In George Orwell's 1984, they had some little sayings which kind of explained the way that they were doing things. They had this little phrase which said, "Who controls the past?" says the party slogan. Who controls the past? Who controls the past controls the future. Is that true? Well, the Second World War, some say, was the result of Hitler trying to recreate a fictitious past. Who controls the past, says the party, controls the future. And who controls the present, they said, controls the past. Now, this is all kind of very complicated, you may think, but I just want to say this, is that what they're really saying is that if you control the past, if you can change the past so that it's no longer the past as you knew it, and it becomes somebody else's created past, Eastern German country, when it was kind of really almost kind of part of the Soviet Union, they used to have a joke when they used to say that Eastern Germany, communist Germany, was the only country in the world which had an uncertain past. What they meant is that they kept on changing their past. And that's what's running through this book, is that they keep on changing the past so that the people can't refer to the past. And one of the other things that they do is that they are working on a dictionary. They are pulling words from the dictionary. They're taking words from the dictionary that they don't want to be in use anymore. And they are redefining words. Why am I saying all this? Well, because I think this is happening on a grand scale at the moment. We are finding that words are being changed. We're finding that the past is being changed. People are wanting to rewrite the past. Because who controls the past controls the future. But who controls the present, if they have their ways, that enables them to control the past. So if these people come to power, then they'll control the past. And if they control the past, they'll control the future. So they're culling the dictionary. I've got a little quote here. You think, I dare say, he says, that our chief job is inventing new words. Not a bit of it. We're destroying words, scores of them, hundreds of them every day. We're cutting the language down to the bone. It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. Of course, the great wastage is in the verbs and adjectives. And he goes on to say, you say, now what on earth is all this about? Well, what he's saying is that if you change words, if you eliminate words, and if you change the meaning of words, you make it impossible to communicate with the past, because their definition of the word is different to the one that you are now having imposed upon you. Let me give you an illustration, and then we'll move off to this and get onto something a bit more wholesome. I, as a young pastor, I conducted a fair few weddings, and often went to the registry office to make sure that the banns had been published, as they say. That's to say that notification had been made properly that the wedding was going to take place between these two people, and that if anyone knew any reason why it shouldn't be, they were requested to kind of come and say. If you got married in the church, they did it differently. They said, if anyone knows any cause or just an impediment why these two persons may not be joined together in holy matrimony, I declare that you now declare it, or ends forever hereafter hold your peace, as they used to say. Well, I used to go into the registry office, and over the door of the registry office, it was beautiful. It was designed so that it would be a very beautiful space for weddings to take place. And it was all oak panel walls, and over the door as you went in, there was a beautiful big oak panel with some writing on it. And it said that this is the registry office where marriages were conducted and would be legal within the United Kingdom. And then it said, for the purposes of this, marriage is defined as the union of one man and one woman for life. In the early 1960s, that was the definition of the word marriage, according to the state of United Kingdom. It certainly isn't the definition now. So if I say marriage and my neighbor says marriage, we almost need to kind of pause and say, well, let's kind of redefine our terms here now so that we know what we're talking about. So things are changing. Things are changing at an amazing rate. And what do we do? Well, do we kind of bunker down and say, no, let's keep our heads down and we'll just kind of pray and we'll do what God tells us to do? Or are there other ways that maybe we could act? There's a story in the Old Testament which I think can encourage us. It's the story of the city of Babylon. The first city, you probably know this, the first city was built by a descendant of Adam, Cain. He was anxious that anyone who found him would carry out God's sentence against him. And he said, well, whosoever slays Cain, God said, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And Jehovah appointed a sign for Cain, lest any finding him should smite him. So God in some way made it clear to the whole world at that time that Cain was under God's judgment and not anyone else's, and that no one else was to carry out a sentence of death against him. And you'd have thought that God, having given that promise to Cain, it would have been enough. Even though he was condemned to wander as a fugitive and a wanderer in the earth. And it goes on in verse 16, and it says, excuse me, and Cain went out from the presence of Jehovah and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. It seems from the scriptural record that the very first city was built in absolute defiance and rejection of God's promise. In other words, God had promised that he would keep his hand on Cain, and he would measure the way in which his disciplines on Cain were operative. But Cain didn't believe it, so he built himself a city. And cities become, in the Bible, nowadays cities can be very dangerous places, but cities in that era were places of safety where you could be safe from your enemies, safe from wild animals, safe from all kinds of things. But it was a faith in a city which was godless. You took your life and your future into your own hands, and you made your own provision. There's a fascinating verse in the Proverbs which says that the name of the Lord is a safe stronghold. The righteous runs into it and is safe. And then it says, for the wealthy man, his strong city is his riches, which are like a wall in his conceit. So when we create cities in ancient times, it was really to defend them so that we could boast that we were absolutely impregnable. No one could touch us. No one could harm us. We had taken our life into our own hands. And the cities become almost kind of a picture of independence from God, of God being shut out of our lives because we have looked after ourselves and we've done our own thing. Now, if we go on a little bit farther into the story, we read about Noah's flood, and then we read about Noah's son, who was Ham, and his grandson was Cush, and his great-grandson was Nimrod. And it says this in Genesis 10, and verse 6 and 14. The sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan, and the sons of Cush, Seber, and Havilah, and Sabta, and Ramah, and Sabteca, and the sons of Ramah, Sheba, and Dedan. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter from Jehovah, before Jehovah. Wherefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Jehovah. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. I'm not going to go into all the details of this, but this is a man of high profile. This is the man who apparently establishes the first kingdom, not just a city, but cities, a kingdom that's called Babel. And his other places, and he builded Nineveh. So let's go and visit the city of Babylon a little bit later on. This is Genesis chapter 11 now, verses 1 to 14. I hope you're 1 to 4. I hope you're keeping up with this. It's a bit simpler anyway than the dystopian novel 1984. This is chapter 11, verse 1. And the whole earth was full of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, listen to this, come, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. And they said, now listen to this, come, Let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Let us make us a name. Let's give ourselves a name. Let's, do you know, if you, there's a word which actually would kind of sum this up. If you denominate us, if you add a name to us, if you give us an identity that everyone can identify with, let's build as a city. Let's build something where we're safe and where we're isolated from everything else, and its town will reach to God, and we'll make us a name lest we be scattered abroad. What they were doing is they were institutionalizing their independence from God. They were going to depend upon themselves and one another. This is a mindset. This is a worldview that they are taking on here. And what we're in the midst of, brothers and sisters, is a tsunami of a worldview which is totally different to the one that many of us grew up with. Let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And God speaks about this, and he says, well, nothing will be denied them because of their unity. Unity is a great power for good or evil. And there is a mind behind the different stages of the world's rebellion against God. It's the one that I often refer to as a cosmic vandal. Jesus referred to him as a thief. The thief does not come, that's to say, the only reason the thief comes is to steal and to kill and to destroy. I have come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. Satan has no creative power. He's a creature. It's really important, I think, for us to understand this. He's a creature, and creatures only have very limited creative powers. So Satan has no direct creative power that's invested in, but he can steal, he can kill, he can destroy. Babylon becomes an image of the power and the glory of false religion. For since the creation of the world, said Paul writing to the Romans, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. And then Paul goes on to make a statement. He says the cause, the source of idolatry, is that men and women have rejected revelation. Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, his invisible attributes, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. You cannot make a statue of something which is invisible, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful. Notice those two little steps. They did not give his God his rightful place, nor were they thankful. And the way back to God is to begin to reverse those steps, to begin to be thankful and to give God his rightful place. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible men and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Can you see a decline, a downward spiral in that? They changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Idolatry defiles the revelation of God. This is why it's taken so seriously in the Old Testament. In a sense, it is the ultimate sin. It tells lies about God. It defames God's character. It is blasphemy. It tells lies about the nature of God. And Babylon becomes the symbol of false relation unified. And we'll see now how it comes unto judgment. God scattered them ultimately, and he called the name of the place Babel, because there God did confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did Jehovah scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Oswald Chambers once wrote that the first sin from God, against God, was independence, and only later did it harden into rebellion. And I think he's right. The first sin was independence, only later did it harden into rebellion. And I see the same pattern in King Saul, the first legitimate king over Israel. His first sin was independence. His next sin was rebellion. It hardened into an attitude. So the time came when the Lord gave the king of the day the treasures of Solomon's temple into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar and established them in Jerusalem. And Daniel chapter 1 and verse 6 refers to some young men. What they did is that they needed kind of a middle class. They needed an office government class. The British Empire did the same thing to man its empire. So they moved people around to do this, and they wanted the best people to put in the best jobs. And what they wanted is people who they could train in the language and writing of their people. They wanted to imbue them. They wanted to fill them, to indoctrinate them with their language and with their culture in writing. And beware, brothers and sisters, books, particularly novels, always have another motive. Be careful. Be careful. If you buy into that, you may find a barrenness kind of coming into your life, to say the least. Well, there were 4 young men. We're given, first of all, in the scriptures in Daniel chapter 1, we're given their Hebrew names. And each one of these Hebrew names actually ends with something which refers to God. So you have Hananiah, and the ayah bit is a link to Yahweh, Jehovah. And you have Mishael, and the El is a link to Elohim. And Azariah. These boys have the name of the true God branded on their lives. And Daniel, of course, Daniel means God is my judge. But then they had their names changed. They were taken captive. They were expatriated into the land in the empire of Babylon. And there they were given this cultural training to recreate a mindset, a world order, a world view. But these young men had something else. And you know how they refused to do it. And you know how they refused to march to the sound of the devil's drum. And to begin with, it started off with something which may seem only a trivial thing. They said, we're not going to defile ourselves with the meat of the king. That's meat that's been offered to idols. This is pre the new covenant. I won't go to that now, but you may need to think about that. This would have defiled them if they had had this, their food as it had been offered, first of all, to the gods of Babylon. And the person who was responsible for them said, well, my life's at stake here. If the king sees that you have gone kind of very lean and you're not as plump and you've lost your color, I'm going to lose my head. And they say to him, well, give us a trial. Just try it and see what happens. And after the period of trial, you know that they were fatter and better flesh and healthier than any of the others. And they became stars. They chose a 3-year course. It actually says quite specifically that they would do this for 3 years. They would be indoctrinated for 3 years with the language and the culture, but they wouldn't defile themselves with the king's food. if Babylon is a kind of a symbol of defiance against God, within Babylon now you have a small group of people who themselves are absolutely in defiance of all that Babylon stands for. He changed their names and put the name of his gods upon them. He doesn't just want your consent, this enemy, he wants your worship. A time came when, if you remember this, a time came when Nebuchadnezzar had some visions and he'd had them interpreted to him. But then he decided that he would do something. He wanted to make his statement. He wanted to do something, and he was going to erect a statue of himself. It would be all gold. It would be, I think, about 90 feet high or something like that. And he was going to make a rule that whenever music was heard, the sound of whatever it was, whether it was the clanging of a tambourine or whether it was something a bit more melodious than that, that everyone throughout his whole empire would bow down and worship Nebuchadnezzar by bowing down and worshiping his God. And then he discovers that he's got some people in his empire. I don't know where Daniel was at this point. This is just these three young men now. These three have someone report them that they are not doing what he says. How are they going to cope with this thing? Well, they have no doubt about how they're going to cope with it. These people, remember, these people are working in a hostile society. They're working in an alien culture. They're working in government offices. They're actually given positions of authority and responsibility in different parts of the kingdom. So they are subject to this kingdom. They are subject to the will of Nebuchadnezzar. But here a line is crossed and they will not cross it. They will serve Nebuchadnezzar. They will be subject to him, but they will not worship him. And they have this amazing statement. These people had lost every physical remnant of their faith. The temple had gone, the priesthood had gone, the city had gone, the monarchy had gone. It was all gone. There was nothing left. Even some of the prophets who were writing to them and saying, just stay down and settle down. Just stay where you are. You know, that famous verse in Jeremiah 29, which is nearly always quoted out of context, whereas it says, I know my thoughts towards you, that the thoughts of hope. And then goes on to say, but you're staying here for 70 years. So if that's hope for you, that's okay, that's all right. And there'll be an end to it anyway. Anyway, the prince of the eunuch gave names to them, etc., etc. And he appointed these people over the affairs of Babylon. Daniel was in the gate of the king. Daniel was one of Nebuchadnezzar's advisors, one of his privy counselors, if you like, if you don't know that language. Let me read you the thing that went out. The herald cried aloud, to you it's commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoso falls not down and worships shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And then some of the enemies of these young men report them to Nebuchadnezzar. And they say, there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee, They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and fury commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, Is it intentional, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that ye serve not my God, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now if you are ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made, well, but if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Worship always precedes service. He wanted their worship. He wanted their mouths. He wanted their souls. He wanted everything that belonged to them. This is totalitarianism. Totalitarianism cannot abide split affections. It will not accept it. And we are entering a time when we have a totalitarian mindset which is being imposed increasingly. How do we respond to all that? This age has a rebellious spirit. And there's a rebellious spirit who even had the audacity to invite Christ to worship him. Fall down and worship me. Serve me. But what was the reaction of these young men? Well, here it is. I love this. This is Daniel chapter 3, verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able. There's their faith in the character of God, in the power of God. The God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. One way or another, he will deliver them. They'll be delivered out of the hand of the king. But look at this one. This is verse 18 of chapter 3. But if not, be it known unto you, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. This is why I said one of my titles for this is, we may burn, but we won't bow. These young men in places of authority, responsibility, they face here something which represents a line in the sand. And if they cross over it, they will be betraying the God that they love and serve. And they will not do it. They are willing to serve the emperor in his empire. They're willing to act as his agents in the provinces. They're able to act as his counselors, as Daniel was. But there's a line in the sand, and they will not cross over it. We need to find the line, because we are bidden in the scriptures by both Paul and Paul and Peter, that we are to be subject to the powers that be. In Romans, Paul speaks about the conscience quite a lot. In fact, Paul speaks about the conscience a lot throughout the scriptures. This is Romans 13, verses 1 to 5. Listen to this. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. Okay, yeah, that's what these young men were doing. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Well, that's the pattern of life that they were living according to. They believed that God had appointed, in fact, the scripture says that God had given authority and power to Nebuchadnezzar over the whole world. Whether he exercised it or not is another matter. That's what God had done. And here Paul says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. I don't know whether you noticed, but there's a missing word in here. Well, there's lots of missing words, I guess, but there's one word that you might have expected. It's the word obey. Paul never tells us to obey the authorities. He actually tells us to be subject to them. Being subject is a disposition. It's an attitude of mind. It's the way in which we regard those that God has in his sovereign will and purpose put in place. And we are to be subject to them in our disposition. We're not to be rebellious in our hearts. We're not to be constantly criticizing government and the rest of it. We're not to be like that. We are to be subject. We're not to speak evil of those who are in high places, says the scripture. We're not to do that, not in a kind of an organized way. We're not. But the word obey is missing. You've got this word subject. And actually, it's always in a form in which it says, make yourself subject to, make yourself subject to. And Peter does the same, make yourself subject to. You see, the powers that God has given are limited. They only have power to do what God has given them to do. And if they exceed it, and in this point, Nebuchadnezzar had exceeded the authority that God had given to him. For God had not given him the power to insist upon worship of the king as of a god. He went beyond it. And these young men were not afraid to dig their heels in and say, this is a line that we will not cross. So they remained subject to him. They submitted themselves, I suppose, to those who took them and bound them and threw them into the midst of this fiery furnace, and this had been heated 7 times more than that. They don't raise a hand in their defense, apparently, but they won't obey the king. Excuse me, I did warn you about this, my throat. They will submit themselves to him. There's a word for this in kind of legal terms. They call it ultra vires. Ultra vires is a Latin term which means beyond the powers. It's used to describe an action taken by an individual or an organization or a country that exists their legal authority or powers. In other words, it refers to action that are outside the scope of what a person or an entity is permitted to do. If the state demands our worship for its behavior, it is ultra vires. It's gone beyond its authority, and we will not cross that line. We are bidden to be subject to the powers that God has ordained, and we will. I endeavor, and I make a success most of it. I keep speed restrictions. I do it because I believe it's within the area of their authority, so I will submit myself to it. But there are some things that if they pass laws about it, if they tell me that I can't preach the gospel in the open air, if they tell me that I have to believe a certain definition of the word marriage, I shall end up in prison at some point, if I tarry and if the Lord tarries. Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O King. But if not, be known unto thee, O King, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Can you see that these people are submitted, but they're not servile? They are submitting themselves. They are holding to themselves the right to submit themselves to the king, and we are bidden to submit themselves to the authorities that be. But it's us that do the submitting. And if it comes to a question of imposing a law upon us which is beyond their authority, then we disobey it, and we face the consequences. We may burn, but we won't bow. So, brothers and sisters, can we settle it in our hearts? If that time should come, if that day should come, when demands are made upon us, when those who want to control our thought processes and impose their own world view upon us, where we say no to them, and there are places in the world where this is already happening, where it means that their possibilities of promotion in their job has ended. It means they can be put in prison. They can be all kinds of things. In some extreme situations, just to claim to belong to Jesus Christ will mean a bullet in the back of the head. So how shall we then live our lives? I think, brother, sisters, what I want to say is we should live it without fear. We should live it knowing that he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Therefore, we may boldly say, I will not fear what man can do to me. We should not look upon these things with fear and dread. We should lift our hearts to God and know that if he brings a temptation, he will bring the grace necessary to see the temptation through. During the time of the religious persecution in this country, there were times when people were often burned to death for their faith. And some of the people would tremble at the thought, the prospect of what they were going to have to go through. And sometimes they would contact their pastors and they'd say, I don't think I have the faith to go through this. I don't think I can go through with this. And the pastors developed a pattern, so I understand, that they counseled them thus. They used to say, don't be afraid. God only gives dying grace in the dying hour. He doesn't give you a store of it so you can stack it up. What he does is he promises his own presence. I will be with you. I'll never leave you nor forsake you. So we need to be ready. The time may come in the West where the world view alters so dramatically that it becomes more and more difficult for us to live as those who are indwelt by the Spirit of God and are taught by Christ as to how to live their lives. But be brave, brothers and sisters. Stand your ground and understand that we don't fight against spirit, flesh and blood, but we understand that there are powers at work in these days. We will submit ourselves. We will choose to submit ourselves to those that God has put in authority over us. But if they go ultra vires, beyond their rights, then we shall disobey them. We shall stand against them, and we will surrender ourselves up for the punishments that come, if need be. These are sobering things, but we're living in sobering days. Let me pray. I don't know, Lord, whether angels cheer, just a speculation, but I think if they do cheer, I'm sure they cheered when they heard these young men say, we may burn, but we won't bow. And I don't think they said it belligerently. I don't think they said it through gritted teeth. I don't think they said it in defiance of the authority that be. They said it simply as a statement of intention. We may burn, but we won't bow. I pray, Lord, that in all our struggles with different world views and mindsets, I pray, Lord, you'll help us not to imbibe a spirit of belligerence and aggression, but that you will equip us, Lord, and make us ready, that we may be able to give a reason for the hope that's within us with meekness and a good conscience. And we look to you, Lord, for dying grace, for the dying hour. Amen.